Good morning and welcome. My name is Kellyanne Denton and I'm the Director of Creative Learning at Imagineer.me. Thank you for making time in your busy lives to share this early morning session with us in this glorious city, in this abundant room with like-minded people. I would like to begin by bringing consciousness to the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would also like for us to be mindful of paying respect to elders past and present. The format will follow such that I will give you the breadth and definitive nature of what visual literacy is and why it's valuable, and then we'll hear from Dr. David White from the University of New South Wales, followed by Alastair Foster. We will give you some time for questions and then we can network and have some brekkie. You may have seen Dr. David White recently on the ABC Catalyst program talking about the work the University of New South Wales does with the federal government in passport fraud, researching the way we see faces and how we compute them. David has collaborated on a range of applied and theoretical problems related to visual cognition. His current work is in collaboration with the Australian Passport Office, and he seeks to improve the accuracy of face identification in the workplace. Then we will hear from Alastair Foster, who has been working in the public cultural sector for over 35 years. He's a Sydney-based writer and award-winning curator. He currently runs an international consultancy that initiates intercultural art and photography projects globally, and his focus is on the creative empowerment of citizens and communities. So we should give you a very comprehensive idea and platform to develop new thinking in the organisations you are responsible for culturing, and hopefully this information will be valuable to you personally as well. So, I know who is in the room because for the most part I've spoken with you. Collectively, you are an elected group of people who are responsible for the learning and development of hundreds of thousands of people, and you are in a very disruptive environment, one that changes rapidly, and you are responsible for putting people in a position that they too can navigate a way through and change rapidly to respond to the direction of your leaders. Some of you are responsible for the same number of people that make up the population of Lismore or Bathurst. I heard some little laughs there because it's actually true. The importance of your role is paramount to the productivity of the companies that you work for, but also the well-being of the people that work for you. 80% of our life is spent at work. We have to be happy about that, and someone has to take charge of making it so, and that's usually you in this room. We are very fortunate to have so much new information available to us, MRIs, EEGs and neuroscientists who can prove to us just how the mind works. The science behind brain plasticity is irrefutable, and that too is disrupting the way we teach others. Visual literacy has recently been included in the national curriculum for school children, but adults, the ones that work for you, have not had the training they need to connect their visual pictures with their verbal pictures. We now have medical technology that allows us to see inside the brain in ways we've never been able to do before. We really are at a frontier where new knowledge is coming out about how we're wired, how we learn, and how we turn that learning into behavioural change. I have good news for you. If what you want is new thinking, innovation, expanded cognitive ability, better problem solving and enhanced communication skills, then follow me on this journey and I will show you a new solution to an old problem. In the 90s, neuroscientists John Kunis and Mark Beaman started studying how and when the moment of clarity, the moment when you solve a problem, when you finally see it differently, actually happens. We call these aha moments. These situations of being able to see things differently become insightful were recorded as electrical activity in the visual brain. They discovered that the visual brain shuts down right before the moment hits you, and they called this brain blink. When organisations talk about innovation, this is precisely where you need to get people to, the visual brain. So, what is visual literacy? Visual literacy is the ability to encode and decode information. It's what we see and how we think about that, and then reimagine it, and ultimately how we communicate it. It is an essential part of cognitive development and increases our capacity to learn in all subject areas, including justice, empathy, relationship and perception, even calculation, logic and classification. These are all attributed to the visual mind. Every individual is an opportunity, and the best thing you can do is breed this thinking through your organisation. If every individual is trained to think differently, the potential of your workforce will develop exponentially. You want people thinking differently, just like the person that tried to get home in a cab, but there weren't any, looked around, saw the street full of cars, and came up with Uber. You want people using their imagination. I have more good news for you. You do find what you're looking for, and we can help people look for solutions. So, how does that translate over an entire organisation? Let's look at it another way. Instead of being able to encode and decode visuals, let's take sound. Imagine an orchestra with musicians who play their instruments well enough but can't read or write sheet music. This is a metaphor for your organisation. The productivity, innovation, leadership spend is not producing what you need from your orchestra, so you put more money into the leadership capacity of your conductors, hoping that they can change things, improve things. In the meantime, there are plenty of new players coming onto the market, and things are changing rapidly, and people's taste in music is changing too. So there's all these changes going on everywhere. Your orchestra is not playing a cohesive tune together, and they never will because they can't. They don't have the skills. They can't read or write sheet music. So how are you going to compete with orchestras that do have skills to not just play, but follow a conductor and also create new music, which is analogous to innovation? Learning to interpret and discuss what we see promotes thinking critically and creatively as well. We tend to see something, then we fill in the blanks with our memories. So what we see depends on what we've seen, and we colour everything with our own bias. Neuroscientists are understanding more and more how we are creating our highly personalised worlds. We don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. And we don't just compute what's out there, we make up most of it. So, what is the visual brain? How do we use it? How do we better develop the potential of the workplace and enrich the capacity of the individual? How do we put people in a position that they can brain blink? Creative thinking is thinking differently, but how do you get people to do that beyond a seminar or a couple of days of training? Visual literacy is the infrastructure that allows people to think differently. We don't think in words, we think in pictures. And when we remember something, we remember the picture in our mind. One of our biggest problems in communication is not being able to marry what we see in our minds with the words we use to describe them. So just imagine how difficult that is for somebody to understand what you mean. Our worlds, including working environments, are part of what we see, which is encoding, and part response, which is decoding. One is a function of the eye, the other is a function of the imagination. We are Imagineer. We are imagination engineers, and we teach visual literacy through a program called the Synergy Program, so that people can better connect what is in their mind with what they actually mean and expand their thinking. I don't need to remind you why, communication is important. Employee absenteeism, disengagement and high turnover is mostly attributed to poor communication. Most communication programs attempt to help without paying attention to how we see things, or be mindful about how other people see things. and it's costing the Australian economy over $33 billion a year. 93% of all that we understand is visual. We have to give people visual skills, and if you don't get them from me, get them from someone who can help you with this, but you need to do it. Do you know how many people are dissatisfied with their jobs? You can reference the following stats that I'm about to go through in the brochures that are there on your seats. "85% of people agree creative thinking is critical for problem solving in their career." This is what your people want from training. Now, I have spoken to so many decision makers who rightly feel sceptical about creative education in general. If you want an innovative creative workforce, consult with art teachers and not management consultants. I've looked at some of the creative thinking programs that are out there in the corporate sector, and I know that they will never work. Creativity is not just about being playful and colourful, about being all touchy-feely and singing together. That's all momentary. If you want a paradigm shift, you need to be thinking and seeing and responding and opening and learning over an extended period of time so that you create a habit. If you want creative innovation, ask a person with tertiary qualifications in teaching creativity. Preferably one that understands science and also has a capitalistic mind, because let's face it, you need to be profitable and you need your creativity spend to be profitable for you. Not being able to encode and decode visual information makes it impossible for us to understand what is in someone else's mind, period. And the disconnect is enormously costly to business, but also to relationships, personal or otherwise. How many times have you heard somebody say, "I don't see what you mean," or quiz someone's comprehension by saying, "Did you get the picture?" So let's have a look at how we see. We use our eyes as a lens to focus on a subject known as pattern or stimulus, and that information is sent via neural pathways to our brains, to the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe. We then add memory and calculate the pictures in our mind with the ones that are in front of us to make sense of them, and we call this percept. It's exactly the same way a camera works. The lens on a camera is like the lens in our eyes. The information is sent to a processor in the camera, or the brain, and burnt as an image in our memory card. This is part of the way we teach visual literacy via photography, and people love it. We have a 96% engagement factor. So visual literacy, sometimes known as long-term memory, is our capacity to learn and use new information. Without visual memory, you simply cannot learn. Our memories are a series of images. They're not text, they're not videos. They are exactly what you would expect to find on a memory card. So let's go back to the story earlier about the orchestra. Guess what? You built that picture in your visual mind. I didn't show you any pictures of instruments, orchestras, conductors. Part of visual literacy is being understood, but the other part is understanding, by using your imagination and using new connections. Everyone in this room drew a picture in your own mind's eye. Every one of you took that from your own memory cards. Every one of those pictures was different. 93% of all that we understand is visual. It makes sense to improve communication and cognitive function with visual learning. If you want your people to learn and grow, and indeed yourself, you need to pay attention to what you see. The more you look at and observe, the more neural pathways you build and the better cognitive function you have. The human brain remembers visual information much better than any other type of input. We read pictures 60,000 times faster, 60,000 times faster than text. So a picture literally is worth 1,000 words, tens of thousands of them. Being good at this is what visually literate people do. Learning and comprehending are about building new neural pathways and retaining the mental images to call upon later, adding to a breakthrough or insight. Innovation and creativity as concept have become meaningless, overused, just words in the boardroom, scrambling around to try and get to a magic place where it all happens. But look how the mind works. Visual activity stored in the brain as mass makes up 30% of the density of our brains. We retain 80% of what we see. A groundbreaking study using MRI technology compared the brains of cab drivers with bus drivers in London. Bus drivers recall routes that are unchanging, but taxi drivers undergo extensive training to learn how to navigate thousands of places within the city. The study focused on the hippocampus, which plays a role in facilitating visual spatial memory. The MRI revealed that the posterior hippocampi of the taxi drivers were much larger than the bus drivers. They had grown their brains. Even more exciting was that the size of the hippocampus directly correlated with the length of time that someone was driving a taxi. So the longer you drove, the bigger the hippocampus, or the more you see, the smarter you get. This study provides a compelling example of the brain's neuroplasticity, or ability to reorganise and transform itself through new experiences and visual stimulus. Having to constantly learn new routes in the city forced the taxi cab drivers' brains to create new neural pathways. These pathways permanently changed the structure and the size of the brain. We can easily change the brain visually, we just have to know how. What we have to do as learning and development, organisational development, and people, culture and change professionals is to provide the infrastructure so that our people build new neural pathways in their brains so that they too have better cognitive function. We can make people smarter, and if we do that while improving communication, we will certainly lift productivity and innovation. The most powerful way to do that is via the visual. Now, I know the how and what of this will appear perplexing to those of you who haven't taught visual language before, but we can help you and we want to. We can start that conversation. A clever way to begin is via visual disruption on a personal level. This means dislodging the rightness that each and every one of us, our good selves included, have in believing what we see is true. The only thing we know for sure is that we don't see things eye to eye, we don't see the same way, but we don't have to. We just have to make room for interpretations for ourselves and others and be inclusive. We need to think visually and creatively because creative people are problem solvers. I see a problem, I create a solution. Think back to Uber. So, as you can see, visual literacy is not just about people going out and creating big data visualizations. That's a niche part of visual thinking. What we have to do is get people seeing things differently and thinking about them differently. Upwards of 65% of us are visual thinkers anyway, so we really need to encourage this process. To do this, we have to disrupt the stronghold people have on what they see and therefore believe. We have to work on stopping people from being blindsided. If we can suspend belief for a moment, which is usually long enough, the mind will look for other ways to interpret the situation and build new pathways and create new thinking. But how do you do that? Everybody talks about new thinking, but how many of us are actually doing it? Well, you are. Every single person in this room is building new neural pathways as we speak. Watch yourselves throughout the day. Start looking at what you're seeing and you will see things differently. This is the place we need to take people because it encourages them to think and to use and reuse the parts of their brain that build new neural pathways and facilitate critical thinking. I'm more likely to believe it when I see it, but let me think about it first. This is also called new thinking. New thinking leads to innovation, and that is creative. We are teachers in creative education. I have a postgraduate degree in visual art and communication. I've been practicing for over 23 years. I have written more curricula than I can pin down over 3 universities and dozens of organisations. I have personally taught thousands of people, one by one, to expand their thinking visually, to be creative, to communicate their ideas and generate more of them. Of all the colleagues that I have worked with doing the same, not one of them, not one, has ever used Play-Doh or plasticine to make the environment, let alone the individual, more creative. It's slightly disturbing to me that this is the staple in creative education in this country. So the fun bits. Yes, a few people in here I'm sure have had some struggles with this dress. The dress went viral in February. In the first week of the image surfacing, it received 10 million tweets alone. This does not include Facebook or stories written in every newspaper and magazine, from print to Time magazine, BuzzFeed, LinkedIn. The Washington Post described the dispute as the drama that divided a planet. Some circles suggested that the dress would prompt an existential crisis over the nature of sight and reality, or that the debate would harm interpersonal relationships. I know it put a bit of stress on some of mine. So what was it about this dress that got us all worked up and enraged, engaged, and motivated to respond? There are 6 credible theories as to why we see this dress differently, but I just want to get a show of hands of who sees this dress as white and gold? Oh, that's, I don't know, what do you reckon? Half? Take a look around and just see how many of you there are. 60? Okay, who are the black and blues? Wow. 65-35? Guess what? We don't see the world the way that it is. We see it the way that we are. We see with our brains. Our brains take the visual information that is presented to us and calculates or computes what it is we think we see based on what we're cultured to see, what we think we see. Tone and shadowing influence this dramatically, but so do patterns and how we compute them as individuals. Ultimately, you find what you're looking for, and we can direct that. Again, given there are several theories as to why, well, it was sort of half the population. The official figure, by the way, is 70-30, so we were really, really close there. I'm going to show you what colour the dress is in a different way. Can everybody see those 3 distinct circles there? Can anyone? Okay, so we got 2. Can anyone not see them? What do you see? You see 3? Yes? 2? You see 2? They're all the same. What you're seeing as being 3 distinct things is actually the background. Your brain is recomputing the background and the foreground and discerning what it is that you think you see. And we do this all day. The dress is blue. You can see it's blue if you disrupt all other visual input. So if you hold your hand up to your eye, close the other one, and shut down all other form of information and just look at the dress, you will see it differently, and it's exactly the same image I showed you before. Still the same? Another important aspect, it does, this dress really gets people going. It's just really. The reason it does is because we're learning for the first time that we see things differently. You know, you take a room of 200 people and you show them one thing, and it's absolutely perplexing to find that half the people see the same thing that you're looking at different from you. But it's a gift. It's an absolute gift. Another important aspect of visual literacy that you may be surprised to know is patterning. We cannot escape the fact that looking for and processing patterns are key to learning and part of the visual process. It makes visual literacy particularly important for people working with finance, numbers, and even justice. We build connections with patterns visually because that's how we receive them. And when we do receive them, we recompute them. If you think this is not relevant to your industry, let me plant this seed. Visual literacy stretches the brain and expands thinking. Finding patterns and building new neural pathways that we can call upon later actually changes the brain. Ultimately, we grow the possibility of what is. And this is what you want your people to do. Think differently, not selectively. Of all the mental abilities, this type of intelligence is said to have the highest correlation with the general intelligence factor, or IQ. This is primarily because pattern recognition is the ability to see order in chaos, the primary condition for life. Juxtaposing is another way we compute, and another way we use patterning in cognition. The way something behaves in relation to another constructs meaning of the visual stimulus. Association makes predicting how people will learn and interpret visual stimulus very easy. Advertisers know this and as a formula, and so should you. Because patterns can be found in ideas, words, symbols, and images, and pattern recognition is the key determinant of your potential for logical, verbal, numerical, and visual spatial capabilities. It is essential for reasoning because your capacity to think logically is based on the perception of the logic around you. So logically, you will look at this image two ways depending on how you choose to think about it. The stimulus, or the pattern, because that's all it is, it's just a two-dimensional shape in the middle of this image here, will be a B when it suits you, and it will be a 13 when it suits you. You choose. We do that all day. American Express know this. They use it to catch defrauders. This was at the bottom of an email sent to me last week. Pictures and patterns, it works. So they may not even know they're doing it, but I presume they've paid some neuroscientists somewhere billions of dollars to tell them that watching patterns is how we help stop fraud in its tracks. But watching patterns is how we build our comprehension and understanding of life. Watching. Every time we learn to see things differently, we open. We get more creative. We build new neural pathways in our mind and marry concepts and ideas with metaphors. And when we learn to decode them, we not only strengthen them, but we gain confidence and have more ideas. Visual literacy stimulates the mind. We can easily get hooked in, we get engaged, it gets you thinking, and surely that's what you want your people to do, not turn up day after day following the same old route like those London bus drivers whose brains had ceased to grow. There are two interpretations here. Like the dress, some people will see this image as a beach scene and others will see it as a portrait. Who sees a beach scene? Who sees a portrait? Yeah, face recognition is something we're really good at. Again, some people see in this image swans and some see elephants. Who sees the swans? See both? Great, that's it. You've just done it. You've just done it. Being aware and learning that people see things differently stops the need to correct them. If you go through your working environments very well aware that the person that you're speaking with may rightly see something slightly different to you, you will accommodate for that. Visual imagery stimulates our minds. It makes us see multiple ways at looking at a message. It makes us think twice. Would you believe that there is no white square in this image? Who sees the right square? Yep. If I reverse the shape, you'll see that it wasn't there in the first place. You just put it there in your mind. Now we have disrupted the rightness and bias, we can then go on and encode new visual messages, which will stretch the brain and the capacity to think critically and culture our teams with the messages we need them to have so that we can share the same vision. We are essentially learning to play the music that your leaders have chosen with sheet music that is directed by your conductors and understood by your orchestra. We are all contributing to the same vision. I don't want to focus on the program that we've developed to teach visual literacy today because I want to focus on what visual literacy is and why you need it. But I will say that we use a technique called SIMR, subconscious image reinforcement, and that can be elaborated on at a later stage post-Vivid. But be sure and know the Synergy program is actually also about focus. And by the way, focus is really simple. Energy flows where intention goes. If you want your people to fully embrace your values and directives, get them to focus on them. Let's say, for example, you had just gone through a merger or a restructure or big retrenchments or sudden growth and you needed to change direction or even products because of market changes. How do you get your people to come along with you, join in and know that they not only understood but embodied the concepts? Here are some examples of the metaphors created by participants of the Synergy program, our visual literacy training program. The concept was together, merge, unite. They got it. They seriously went out to seek these analogous representations of what they meant. Brought the narratives back to the group as ideas. The group interpreted each other's concepts, built new neural pathways, and the values and directives became a discussion that was embraced, understood and decoded. This was shot on an iPhone. It's important to remember when we look at these that these are not photographers. These are adults who don't play with plasticine but do other things with their creative minds. Together, merge, unite. People see things in different ways. We know that. This is the same concept interpreted by a different individual. The new learning skills of narrative and storytelling become a habit and the vision is clear. People bought in and become engaged because the process is pleasurable to them. Personal, social, learning, building new pathways and feeling good about ourselves, about being creative, about contributing to the vision in a way that's easy for us. What this does is it reduces the rhetoric down to a single idea. Simplification of ideas is so powerful. The next three images are based on the concept of large and small. The idea was to get participants of a large government organisation to understand what being small looked like and felt like to the individual dealing with government. So government's huge, you know, and you're just one little person on the end of the phone or in the line. I'm getting a nod over there. You've felt that as well. So they really wanted people to know what that felt like. So they went out and built what that felt like. I think this is extraordinary. Oh, you can't see it. In the back, the visuals are not so strong here, but in the back there's the Australian flags and this tiny little frame in the foreground. Perspective. what your people are doing in this process is looking for metaphors. It helps to reinforce learning, but it takes a lot of time before they find them. This program is based on the 70-20-10 principle. They go out looking for these concepts and ideas which take a period of time, over a month, but ideally by that stage people are already in this habit of thinking, so it becomes their second nature and the dominant discourse. There is a visual cortex in each hemisphere of the brain. When we teach visual literacy, we use both sides. Part of our program is mathematical and mechanical, which is great for the left, analytical brain. The other part is the imagination, which is great, for the creative brain, development of the creative brain. We also strengthen verbal skills via the visual brain, and this is what we call whole brain learning, or what we also call SIMMER. If your people can't agree on the colour of a dress, how do you expect them to comprehend the vision of your leaders or even your organisations? The thing is, you can't. It would be really helpful for you to ask people that you work with, how do you see it? And then the next day say to them, what do you think about that? Because of the same topic, because you'll get two different answers. And therein lies the contradiction, which makes it impossible to build authenticity and trust, because the one conversation you're having with the one person is coming from two different ways in which they think, which are not united, and it's not consistent. Ideally, you want to get to a point where you're asking people either one of those questions and the answers are aligned. If the message is aligned, not only will it be communicated effectively, it will be understood and can therefore be actioned, and your productivity will increase because everyone will be on the same page. We simply cannot discount the visual mind's role in this because the science proves it is absolute. It's the way we work. 93% of all that we understand is visual. So, plenty of people do this well. Advertising agencies, data visualisation experts, photographers, they know exactly how to interpret information so people understand it. Visual intelligence is the ability to process visual material and employ both physical and mental images in thinking. Physical and mental images employed together in thinking. As a result, people with high visualisation IQs find it easier to comprehend information and communicate it to others. Your visualisation skills determine how well you perceive visual patterns and extract information from them. Visualisation also facilitates the ability to form associations between pieces of information, something which really helps improve problem solving. So the breakthrough you're looking for in a disruptive environment is a visual one. So in summary, the value of visual literacy in the workplace is that it builds new neural pathways in the brain, which encourages critical thinking, and oddly enough, simplifies thinking at the same time. It disrupts blind minds and encodes new information. Information that you choose because it's right for your organisation at this time. You can keep changing it, evolving it, growing it. It teaches people to use metaphors, to challenge what they think, open to other people's interpretations and accept them without making the other person wrong. It teaches you how to focus and communicate with the intention of understanding, but also being understood. It makes people feel good about themselves while they grow their brains. It absolutely develops creative thinking, which in real terms is innovation. That has to be good for business. So I would finally like to ask you to go back to your lives and explain verbally what you have seen and understood visually this morning. Be mindful of how you're doing it, and equally mindful of the picture other people have in their minds. For those of you who are here in groups of 10 or 20, you will have a different experience for people who are here on their own and going back and trying to explain to somebody a vision that the other person hasn't seen before. So with that in mind, think about how difficult that is every time you're communicating with somebody to try and work out if that other person is there with you. This will help you to understand not only what the value of visual literacy is in the workplace, but it will ask another question. Can your organisation afford to devalue visual literacy in the workplace? And if so, what is the cost of that? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Kellyanne for inviting me here today to speak. It's not my normal audience here, so I'm a little bit outside my comfort zone. I'm a cognitive scientist, so being in the context of art here is not really my thing, but I think here Kellyanne has seen the link between our work at UNSW and the work she's doing here, and it really does show a lot of foresight, because listening to her talk there, I think I can see a lot of parallels between the type of problem we are trying to solve at UNSW and the type of problem you're trying to solve in the workplace. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today the work we have been carrying out in collaboration with the Australian Passport Office. And I guess in a way we've been trying to teach visual literacy in the workplace. I'm going to explain to you the problem that we call the passport problem and steps that we have taken to solve it through training and selection of people with natural abilities in facial identification. I'll also talk a little bit at the end about some experts in this area and why their visual expertise that they demonstrate is a particularly interesting form of visual expertise. So I'd just like to start by setting some theoretical context. As a cognitive psychologist, I'm not, my work isn't to show pictures of brains lit up like Christmas trees. You won't see any of that today. Cognitive psychologists try to map and understand the cognitive processes involved by making broad generalizations about cognition. So this here is a very broad model of human decision-making. And here I'm going to talk specifically about its relevance to visual expertise. So the two systems that have been proposed, and this has been popularized quite recently by Daniel Kahneman, are labeled here as System 1 and System 2. Now, the System 1 is the system that we most rely on in our daily lives to see us through the day. It allows us to ride bikes. It's thought of as the sort of gold standard in expertise. These are processes that we have evolved to process automatically without control and without any conscious thought. System 2 are the type of processes that don't rely on this pattern matching ability, but instead are effortful, slow and self-aware, the type of feeling that you have when first learning to ride a bike. It's one you have to think about every single aspect of that process, that you feel the handlebars and the pedals and the entire balance. Quite quickly that becomes an automatic process. And the automatic System 1 processes dominate our visual system. And so it's often, and this is recently Daniel Kahneman's popularization of this distinction, he called it Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow was the title of his recent book. So the benefit of this automatic processing, and it's very quick, it enables to recognize objects in our visual world as things that might kill us, things that might love us, etc. And also System 1 is blamed with a lot of errors that we make in our daily lives because it is automatic and it sort of relinquishes control. Although in psychology we talk about this as expertise, as a trajectory moving, as I say, when riding a bike, from something that's very controlled and thoughtful and clumsy in a way, towards something that's fast and efficient. And as I say, when we come to recognize objects in our visual world, system one is the thing at play. So we tend to think of expertise as this type of trajectory. Now, if I was to get you to memorize that configuration, that visual array there, and then ask you to reconstruct it on this chessboard, I'm betting that you would have a very difficult job in doing that. Now, well, that's true unless you're a chess expert. Okay, so this study is a classic in cognitive psychology. They asked grandmasters to memorize the types of visual array I just showed you and had them reconstruct the patterns on the chessboard. Now, what you find is that the experts are extremely good at doing this. They make almost no errors, you can see, when the positions were configured in normal chess playing positions. So really, there is the strength of visual expertise. They're able to recognize these configurations on a chessboard. And yet, when those positions are presented in a random order, such as they don't reflect a real position in a chess game, the experts are no better than the novices. And so this visual expertise has its limits. It's a pattern recognition process. So here is a recent study from the psychological literature, and they set the task here is to find nodules of tissue in the lungs that may reflect cancerous tumors. And so they set this task to X-ray radiographers and also to novices. Now, what the experts were very good at doing is detecting, as you'll be glad to know, these nodules of tissue. What they were very poor at recognizing is that in the final image in the test, they had inserted a very large gorilla, which is about 10 times the size of the nodule. And so actually, in this task, the novices were better at finding that gorilla. And it's a phenomenon called inattention blindness. So we're kind of blinded, as Kellyanne was saying earlier, by our expertise and our familiarity with the task, and sometimes miss glaring things in our visual array. Now, I study face recognition, and this is the gold standard of System 1, if you like. This is something that through our experiences in our lives and evolution, we have evolved to do remarkably accurately. So if I were to ask you to identify these two people here, I'm betting that almost all of you will recognize that on the left-hand side, is George Bush, and on the right is John Travolta. And it's incredibly, and look, there's only 10 pixels between the eyes in these images, and yet I'll guess a large proportion of you would have recognized those images and discriminated the one on the right from someone similar, say Elvis Presley. Now, the problem is that this System 1 expertise, and this is what we call the passport problem, this System 1 expertise does not transfer to this type of decision here. And the key difference is these are unfamiliar people. Now, if I was to ask you, if you can raise your hands if you think this is the same person, please. And raise your hands if you think it's two different people. So about half of you in the room will be surprised to know that this is two images of the same person. And these images aren't taken, we've not made any deliberate changes to these images to make this task difficult. This is a difficult task because you're not familiar with that face. It's just a trivial task to decide if these two images are the same person or not. And these are sampled in exactly the same way. The lighting conditions aren't standardized. There's expression differences between these two images. And yet, it's just not a problem when you're familiar. So there is a real limit of our visual expertise. We somehow assume that we're going to be able to identify people from their face, despite the fact that we're actually very bad at doing it. So we're terrible at this type of situation. And it turns out that passport officers are also terrible at it. The study we published last year, their performance on a standardized test of face matching was exactly the same as students. So, this is the passport problem, and it's why we're currently funded partly by the Australian Passport Office and also by the Australian Research Council under a linkage project to try to solve this problem, to try to train people to perform the task accurately. So how do we do that? Well, we sort of reasoned that System 1 is already very expert at doing this thing with familiar faces. We've built this system already. It doesn't seem that that system can deal with unfamiliar faces, and so the expertise that they try to train in this type of situation is actually to go in the opposite direction to what we normally think, and to see things past the level of the object, to see the face perhaps not as a face, but just as a visual array. And so people have been trained on this task for from a number of years. They've been trying to train performance. In fact, this is a photo taken in the 19th century. So they've been trying to train this ability for a very long time. And interestingly, as I say, the process that's used in this training is not one of this holistic pattern matching grabby process, but instead to break the features down in the face and to apply a sort of piecemeal comparison, a logical comparison. And this is this type of training that is provided by the FBI to facial examiners. Most recently, we've found that these facial examiners are far better than novices on the task, but they're only really better, or the expertise is shown most starkly, when you give them a lot of time to do this. So this isn't a quick, trained process. This is something that they are having to engage with the image at a level below the object, and that takes time. So you might have noticed that, well, for those people that thought these were two different people, probably what you didn't notice is the facial marks on these images are very similar. And it's at this level of detail we think that the forensic examiners are looking when they're making these decisions. They're starting to see features in the face that we are blind to because of our expertise with faces. Interestingly as well, if you disrupt the process, the System 1 automatic process, by turning the images upside down, this doesn't really affect examiners, facial forensic examiners, as much as it does novices, which again is evidence that the System 1 isn't the dominant thing here. In fact, by turning faces upside down, this is something they practice in their daily work, and it's a trick that they've borrowed from artistry. So in drawing, this is the sort of a text in the 1970s that for people of that generation was thought of as drawing 101, and one of the tricks they tell you to practice is turn the images upside down, and you start to see that as a collection of lines, not as a figure. And that is the type of process that we are trying to tap into. I'm just going to very finally end on a note, because I'm here in the MCA. Some of you may have been to an exhibition here. It was the last major exhibition that was shown at the MCA, and this was the work of Chuck Close, who is an artist, a photorealist artist in the US, who reconstructs photographs on his canvas in minute detail. You can see here the pores in the skin, such as the level of detail in these images. And he uses this grid system often to show these faces. He applies a very scientific, methodical process. And here you can see the little elements in this image are almost like little abstract paintings in themselves, and yet they come to make this whole picture. So he's seeing faces in a different way at a level beneath the object. But the very interesting thing about Chuck Close is that he is unable to recognize the faces of his friends and family. So he can make these very large, beautiful images and reconstruct these images of faces, but has a condition known as prosopagnosia, which is an inability to recognize faces. So his System 1 is broken, and yet he is able to make these beautiful things. So we hypothesize that something similar is going on in forensic image comparison, and that by tapping into that more effortful process that we can improve performance in this task. And so thank you very much for listening.
Hello, everyone. On the 25th of May, 1961, just months into his presidency, John F. Kennedy stood up in front of Congress and more or less committed the Americans to have a man on the moon before the end of the decade, and indeed safely return him home. NASA went into overdrive. They had this incredible problem to deal with, and they had technologies that were significantly less sophisticated than the iPhone you have in your pocket today. They brought in a man called George Land, who was a specialist in creative thinking, and he developed a battery of 8 tests to look at divergent thinking. Because NASA needed to bring in scientists and engineers who were not only experts in their field, but who could think outside the box, who could innovate. These were totally new challenges that they were going to be facing. In 1965, the educational system changed in America, and the Head Start program came in, and Land converted or changed the test to be suitable for children, and he began an extraordinary longitudinal piece of research. He tested 1,600 children who were entering primary school, 4 to 5 years old. 5 years later, as they were coming to the end of their primary, he tested them, the same group, again. And 5 years later, as they were just entering high school, he tested them for a 3rd time. In that period, he also tested some 200,000 adults over 25 years old. What was really interesting were the results. They were not what was expected. The 4 to 5-year-olds, 98% of them registered as geniuses in divergent thinking. By the time they were 9 or 10, this had dropped to 32%. And by the time they were entering high school, it was down to 10%. Of the adults, only 2% registered as geniuses in divergent thinking. How could this be? Well, one argument is that the infant brain is much more plastic than when we become older, and it's an argument that is made for why we, with very similar genetics to chimpanzees, are incredibly much more intelligent. At least we think so. I think the chimpanzees may have a different view. But it's called neoteny, and it's a process by which our development continues in early childhood. However, more recent research has shown, as we've been hearing today, that in fact neural plasticity continues, particularly if it's encouraged. And indeed, as we get older, other kinds of neural plasticity in different parts of the brain actually increase. So if that isn't the argument, if that isn't the reason, what could it be? And a very strong argument is that in fact it's a problem of education. That what we do in education is we focus upon convergent thinking. Now that's very important. It's about optimization. It's about getting down and concentrating on a particular set of things that need to be done. But if you do that without, first of all, having divergent thinking, then actually you don't even begin to look at all the possibilities of the way of solving a problem. You simply go down to optimizing the solution that's already been selected. So in fact, in many ways, because there's an emphasis upon reading, writing, and arithmetic, and governments of both complexions, when panicked into thinking they better do something about education, default to the idea that we need to be teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, not that we might be encouraging the natural abilities in divergent thinking to remain into adulthood. I want to tell you a personal story now to kind of illustrate a little bit about what I'm talking about. And in order to set that in context, I just need to tell you a little bit about what I do. So I work as a writer and an editor and a curator. I previously spent about 20 years running national arts organizations, and I've just completed a PhD. I tell you this because when I was leaving primary school, I was educated in England. And when I was leaving primary school, I sat, as everybody did, the 11+ exam, which was a sorting exam to decide whether you would be allowed to go to grammar school or not. And the exam was really the first exam you sat as a child. It was introduced to you in a way that was, you could basically describe as shock and awe. So we were terrified by it, and it focused upon our ability to read at speed and comprehend, to write particularly and spell correctly, and to do mental arithmetic. The results came back, and my teachers, within the euphemism of the day, told my parents I was educationally subnormal. There was another test that had been introduced, and it was, it was kind of introduced as, this isn't really very important, and it was more like kind of play. And it was about pattern recognition and playing around with visual things in space and so on, and it was great fun. And I did quite well at that. And it turned out this was called an intelligence test. One wonders what the other test was measuring. But, and so the teacher said, oh, well, maybe he's just lazy, So I went through secondary school mostly with the label lazy. But I managed to, particularly became interested in science and in physics, and particularly those aspects of physics that involve conceptualizing complex things that are beyond what we come across in daily life. The very big things, the very small things. I went to university, and about second year in university, my tutors were concerned that I just couldn't keep up with the level of amount of reading that I needed to do, and they sent me to a new research area in the university that was looking at learning. And I did a number of sessions with a lady there who did various tests and asked me about family history and declared that I was, in fact, not lazy but dyslexic, and sent me away. That was it, I wasn't lazy, I was disabled, but that was a better excuse. So 10 years after that, my son was born, and fairly early on in his life, he was diagnosed as dyslexic. By this time, it had become a middle-class epidemic, dyslexia. And we were really concerned as parents about how to help him through this. I was particularly, because I felt, I'd had to work quite a long time before anyone recognized that it was a problem. And we came across a really interesting book by Ron Davies called The Gift of Dyslexia. And it completely turned on its head the idea about what dyslexia was. Dyslexia wasn't a problem, it was actually a different way of going about things. And I realized, and have realized since, that in fact, I'm a much better curator, but also a much better writer and editor because I'm dyslexic. Now, curating is probably more obvious. I can look at a spatial, organizational challenge in a gallery and more or less immediately see the solution. And I have to wait while everybody else goes through, well, if we do it this way, we could look at it, and we do it this way, and then they compare them, and eventually, through convergent thinking, whittle it down. Whereas to me, it seems to just come like that, because the reason I can't read fast, and the reason that I still can't spell, but luckily my computer can, is that the letters that make up a word, for me, don't stay in a particular order. I mean, why always looking one direction along a word and always with the letters in the same place? Much more interesting to say, well, what about if they're like this? So, it's a little disability in a way in terms of those particular mechanisms, but then computing has stepped in at just the right time for me. But I think it makes me a better writer, and it certainly makes me a better editor. And the reason is that when I read, I still speak the words in my head. I've learned now not to move my lips when I'm doing it, but I actually hear the sound of the words. So when I write, I don't just write for meaning and content. I write for the cadence and euphony of the sound of it, the aesthetics. And that is a very important part of the rhetorical and pleasure aspects of reading. I also write a lot in preparation for translation into Chinese. English is an incredibly ambiguous language. We don't realize it if we're native speakers, but it's a context-based language. French isn't. French, when you're writing it down, it's half as long again as English, but they do say exactly what they mean. We say something which we understand what it means in the context, but it could mean a lot of things. Because I read and actually sound the words in my head and can change the emphasis in the way I'm reading a sentence, I'm much more aware when ambiguity is present in the sentence and can construct that sentence differently so that a translator who is reading it and putting it into a completely different set of grammar and language can actually get the right content across and not misunderstand what's being said. Howard Gardner described us as having multiple intelligences, not just the intelligences of literacy and computation, but intelligences particularly visual, which is what we're talking about today, emotional intelligence, interpersonal, our social abilities, introspective, our ability to go within ourselves and think. And later on, he even introduced what he called natural intelligence, a nurturing a relationship with the environment, and existential intelligence, an ability to look at the really big questions of cosmology and the nature of being. What he emphasized was that these don't describe different kinds of people. We all have these intelligences in some level and mixture, and we're all unique. What's really important is that we don't over-focus on one kind of intelligence because somehow it seems to be, you know, the academic thing or the smart thing, but actually we take a holistic view of ourselves. We live in a world of incredible change at the moment, and that offers great opportunities. It also offers incredible challenges, and I think some really serious threats. If we as a community and we in our organizations are going to address that with the full panoply of our intelligence, then organizationally we have to engage all of our intelligences. But even more than that, we have to do it within ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to find out if anyone has some questions that they would like to have answered, or direct them to a particular speaker. So we have two microphones. Our Imagineers Tom and Tutor is here. So does anyone have any questions? Or may I ask, who has the first question?
Hi, Kellyanne. Here.
Oh, yes.
I'm very interested in the idea of how we work with these ideas of stimulating people's visual literacy when we work with a wide range of people with a wide range of abilities, natural and compromised in various ways. How do we then draw out some of the ideas that you're talking about if we're working with people who've got perceptual challenges or physical disabilities?
Well, one thing that we can do, if we assume that the people that you work with can see, is ask them what they see. When we were talking about the orchestra before, you were building that picture in your mind. What's really helpful is to mirror back to people. So generally, good visual language teachers will listen to somebody's story, and their story won't really come out, properly at first, but we're trying to pull that sort of story out and staying with them and helping them to see. And then when they can do that, they start to get courage and they start to feel good about themselves. The thing is with creative education, and pretty much education in general, you've really got to make people feel safe. If people feel safe, they will move on from that platform. So it doesn't really matter if you're teaching people with disabilities. In fact, you can have people with disabilities in the same group as people without disabilities. It doesn't make any difference because it's about how you communicate and how you see. And nobody's really right or wrong. We're just training people to be aware that we do see things differently, and they get it. They get it pretty quickly, and they filter that through other areas of their life. As soon as that becomes a practice, we don't teach any courses under 4 weeks. So it's 3 hours a week for 4 weeks. We break it down because they go through a process of forming this habit and they enjoy it. So disability is fine. Really what you want to be able to do is to give people confidence and help them and just get them up and running. They'll start to jog and then they start to run and then they will go. You will be irrelevant. They're off. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
I'm just interested in where this fits with the whole idea of neuro-linguistic programming. And so this is emphasising, I'm not an expert in that area.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Okay. I'm interested in how you see the fit with this with neuro-linguistic programming, which was I'm not an expert, but how, because this is very much emphasising the visual, and I know at different stages people have been talking about and advertisers have got it down pat, that link with the sound and kinesthetic. So even when you were describing about the running now, you actually sort of did a visual, you actually physically embodied that, and so that was in a way, you were incorporating those elements in your communication. And I suppose here, we're so screen oriented that, it's the visual, it's the visual, it's the visual. But in actual interpersonal, we've got those other elements as well. We're talking, we're using our tone of voice, and I think in education at certain phases too, people, especially with kids, have been talking about how do you deal with those kids that are more kinesthetically oriented. They need to physically embody the learning with the visual. So whether that's taking some action or physical movement of some kind. I wonder where this
I think I see what you mean.
fits.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. I mean, NLP I've never done a course in, but there are some relationships between the way that they teach, people to do whatever they do. One of them is that when we're talking from our visual brain, we tend to go down because we're reading, and pretty much everyone does that. When you're talking to people and they start telling you a story and they go down, they're immediately retrieving information from their visual mind. In NLP, I think that's called, when you go up, you're in your imagination. So when you're talking to somebody and they're looking up and then they go up there, it hasn't happened yet. They're using their imagination. I think that NLP actually call that lying. So because it's being created, it's not true. So there are some relationships between them. I'm not sure how exact they are. But getting back to the second part of what you said about the screen, one of the really big problems with this screen culture that we have is constant encoding. So with your e-learning programs, I'm not sure if you're aware, but e-learning is actually only 7% effective. It's just done en masse because it's cheap. The C-suite will say, yep, okay, get that in, I'll sign it, because they see the cost of it compared to other forms of training. But it doesn't decode. So getting back to our lady over here with people with disabilities, what the main thing was getting people talking and fluid and connecting with their visual mind and getting the confidence for that. That's what we don't have with screen learning. And the third part of your question was the interpersonal. We really need to listen. I was following where you were going and sitting visual anchors down so that I could answer and work out what it is that you wanted to say. We really need to help people train to do that better. That's the listening. It's the understanding and being understood, and we're not good at it. Some people are. If anyone's going to be good at it, it will be you in this room because you're trained in these areas. But you know what it's like when you get to work or on Facebook. There is not a lot of training in this area at all. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it was good, yes, because I know it came from the NLP thing, came through a family therapy perspective where they realised that people were missing communication because some were more kinesthetically oriented, some more oral, and how do you kind of see where or get an understanding of where different people are predominantly coming from.
Right, we have to, that's precisely such a valuable point, because we really do have to try and see where people are coming from before we decode and we respond. It's just a habit. Does somebody else have a question? Yes.
Have there been any studies done on how that plays out with different cultures? Increasingly, our workplace is very diverse in terms of cultures, and a large part of that is Asian cultures. And is there been any study done on the visual literacy stuff and how that plays out in different cultures?
Well, I know from in our research, so this sort of system 1 process of face recognition, of course, Australian Passport Office and immigration have to match a lot of photographs of different ethnicities, people from, and in the face recognition literature there is an effect called the other race effect, which basically is that it's more difficult to recognize people from ethnicities other than your own. And that's thought to be sort of due to two things. One is the sort of visual processing that, so we're just more familiar with people of our own race, and so we've built a very sophisticated model, let's say, in our head for recognizing that schema, that general form of image. And that doesn't apply so well when you try to apply it to people of an ethnicity other than your own, just because your visual diet hasn't been exposed to that. But there is also sort of research showing that there are social aspects to that as well. So I think, you know, if you were to train that tendency away, you'd maybe not want to just focus on the visual, but other aspects of cognition as well. Sorry.
I could maybe... strategically, I use curation now as a way of building intercultural conversation. I'm particularly interested in how to build connections across the Pacific. I think that we're going to see over the next 10, 20 years a major shift in global center from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Atlantic is essentially bordered by cousins. The Pacific is bordered by cultures that are as different from each other as anywhere on the planet. And so I do particularly work bringing visual arts exhibitions between Latin America and Northeast Asia. The intention isn't to build agreement or even really understanding. I think that the cultural frameworks for understanding are so different that that's a really big thing to ask, and perhaps an inappropriate one. What I am interested in is building empathy, to understanding a common humanity while respecting cultural difference, a difference of being able to, a different way of seeing the world, and therefore obviously a different set of conclusions that come from that. And I think, as I said, you know, we live in a time of change. It is a change of opportunity. It's also one of threat. I think the great opportunity of a Pacific-centered world is that we will get away from this idea that we're all moving in a trajectory towards a single destination. There was a book written at the end of the last century, in the 20th century, called The End of History. And the idea was that, you know, events would carry on, but that basically the whole focus of history had been towards an American view of a democratic free market. We now know that that was foolishness, of course. I think that foolishness is something we can escape if we can develop empathy and an ability to work together through mutual respect, while actually empowering ourselves by all the multitude of different views we have of seeing the world and different conclusions we draw. And it'll be a sign of our maturity as human beings and communities and individuals that we can actually accept those differences and work together on the world, rather than fight over who's right and who's wrong.
Hi, my question's about communication and visual literacy. You made several comments or put up lots of slides earlier saying how communication had resulted in lots of things failing, organisations, profitability, projects and so on. I guess for me that gave me the picture of communication being from leaders, project leaders, management, team leaders, so on, to large groups of people. So that might be a misconception in itself. But I just wanted to ask you, can you go over again sort of what the role of visual literacy in improving that communication? And was I right to think of that on kind of a large scale, or were you more talking one-on-one and simply understanding a different person's point of view?
Thank you for the question. What you kept doing, you're a visual thinker, by the way, so when you were talking to me, you kept looking over there because that was the bit that you were trying. Yeah, that's the bit that you were trying to get to in your mind. So the concept in your mind that you were articulating was actually over there. So with leaders, I think that there's a lot of emphasis on, leadership training. And I think it's very heavy-handed because with communication, it's a two-way street. So even if you invest heavily and you put your leaders through the rings, they're like circus performers, they're brilliant. The people that they're communicating to may not understand them, and that's the disconnect. We really can't leave anybody behind because having fabulous, powerful, brilliant leaders is great. But if your people can't read them, they're not going to clap. So that's what I mean by communication. You really need to get people coming together. And the easiest way to do that is visually, because most of us are visual for a start. But secondly, 93% of all that we understand is visual. It's a great place to start. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great, thanks.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
So visual literacy in the workplace, what do you see as some of the obstacles enabling it to be successful in the workplace?
Change managers. A lot of people really want change and they know that they need to do something new. They know they need new thinking and they know they need innovation, but they're afraid of it. So to be honest with you, a lot of the time when I'm talking with people or introducing concepts to people, sometimes I have to bypass the change managers and go to the next level up, because the next level up will say, listen, I don't care who does it, I just want it done. Whereas the change manager will block it because it's change. And it's great, and I've got a few smiles. You probably know that. One of the biggest blocks is the fear of doing something new. People are not comfortable with it. And that's why you have to go really slowly and you have to get people safe. And getting back to empathy, as Alistair was saying before, we do really have to empathise and listen and work out where people are. We're not on the same page. We don't start on the same page, but we don't have to. And we actually don't even have to agree. We can do new things. We can do new things as a group, and we can do them at different speeds. We just need to accommodate each other and get out of our own ways. Yes. Sorry for all the change managers in here. By the way, all the change managers in here are the ones that did try something new. There's a whole bunch out there that didn't.
Hi, Kellyanne. You mentioned that, I suppose my question is, where do you start? Where do you take this? How do you sell it? At what level do you go in and sell it? For example, CEOs are used to having a predictable formula and they almost know what they're going to expect.
Right.
But this is not so, you don't know what to expect from this. So how do you sell that to the CEO and not make them nervous?
Yeah, this concept is not new, actually. It's just new in corporate Australia because they have been doing, actually corporate Earth, because they've been doing things, their way, and this is how they do them, which is precisely what you said. But, this is old school stuff. I mean, I went to university 20 years ago, more, and, that's what I was doing then. So really, you're right, we do need to help the C-suite understand that the innovation and the creativity that they're looking for has to come from creative people, One thing that really alarms me is a recent decision by a big bank to ban PowerPoint to their 33,000 staff. There's a few smiles over here. You don't work for that bank, do you? Oh, good. And the reason was because the amount of time people spend on PowerPoint was costing the bank nods, costing the bank a fortune, and all the courses that they put people through to learn how to use PowerPoint didn't fix the problem. So PowerPoint had to go. There's nothing wrong with PowerPoint. The problem is that people are not able to put a visual message together that matches their verbal ones. Another nod. So there's a lot of people resonating with some of the problems that are going on here. So yes, it is difficult to get people to see things in a different way, and that includes the C-suite. But a lot of the solutions that they're looking for that's going to save them a lot of money, it just takes some time, about 4 goes, I reckon, and then eventually you wear them down. Yeah, it's not easy. It's new. New is never easy, and neither's change.
In terms of the visual literacy, where would you source sort of the most effective images per se? Because everyone is looking at it from their own perspective. So, if you are trying to engender change, where would you start sourcing images or things, or would it be something that an individual needs to find for themselves?
Well, personally, for me, I've been doing this for a very long time, so I know if we have to work with a particular theme, I know which artists and photographers and which storytellers have dealt with that theme, and then I will look at it in 3 or 4 different ways, and then I will present that to people as Storyville. So people just sit down and they don't even know what's going on, but they're just watching this story and they get taken on a ride. And then we ask them to go and find the images themselves over a period of time. So they go about their lives and their journey, Tuesday afternoon on the bus, Sunday morning at, little athletics with the kids, all sorts of stuff. People are looking through their lives all the time, seeing things differently. So the imagery comes from a combination of places. That's not necessarily easy for change professionals or, HR departments or, learning and development to do, because you don't have that 20 years experience, but we can help build that for you. So you tell us what you need to deal with. I mean, some people have got life so good, that's the problem. I dealt with a company once that had very, very low staff turnover, and they had the old guard, but their company was growing dramatically, and the new guard, the innovative ones, were actually not allowed to innovate because they were like, well, no, that's not how we do things around here. It's worked perfect. I've been here for 10 years, works perfectly good this way. So they really needed to break that up. So that was the theme. But where do they start with that? Well, we do. We write it for them so that we bring all those narratives in, and then those narratives become part of the dialogue and the metaphor, and they just slowly, like Olympia had asked before with the, breaking down the C-suite, we just slowly break people down. It doesn't happen in a seminar. It's not going to happen in a 2-day course. It has to feel good and feel right. Does that answer your question? They're hard to find. It's a good question. You need to know where to look. We do. Okay, well, if we have time for one more question, otherwise it's time for brekkie.
There's a lady over there as well, so maybe 2.
This is about brain plasticity. So I was going with the examples that the 2 gentlemen gave about Chuck Close finding a different way to recognize faces by painting them in a great deal of detail. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Alistair, is it? Yep. And where you were talking about dyslexia and how kind of embracing that as a gift, you've been able to expand how you work. Is Chuck Close better at recognizing other faces now that he's done that? And are you able to read differently or better? I mean, has it improved the part of the brain that wasn't functioning as well, perhaps, as we expected?
Well, I would say maybe his brain was functioning differently, and what he brings is insight to us rather than repairing himself. I mean, I think we have to look at the strengths. You know, it's interesting that Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania, which is considered by many to be one of the kind of most adventurous museums in the country, is funded by a gambler who's autistic. And he's found a way of using autism extremely well to play poker and make enough money to be able to fund a museum that's better than really probably any of our public museums. So, you know, I think we have to stop thinking about the idea that every quality that's innate within us is something to be repaired, and actually see them as the beginnings of things that if we learn how to use them as tools, we can actually enrich not only our own lives, but actually enrich the teams in which we work and the communities in which those teams operate.
So just to follow on from Alistair's answer, I think, you know, Alistair said earlier that these multiple intelligences. The specific case of Chuck Close, I think from our perspective, it's multiple routes to identification. So the fact that he reconstructs these images using a sort of back route to identification, as you were, gridding off, and just it's a different route to identification. And it only is specific to the faces that he paints. So that was his way, he said in that quote, of implanting that in his mind. But I don't think it helps him necessarily recognize other people's faces in his daily life.
So if I can summarize what you're saying is focus on the gifts that you've got. Yeah.
Work with where you are.
Yeah.
Start where you are and be happy with that. Okay, well, we are one team and one community. This is so fantastic that there are so many people who are all really following the same path. So please stay for breakfast and look at this beautiful view. And again, thank you very much for being here.